Success in business can take hard work, determination, and a lot of luck.
Gordon McGregor, when he walks across from Windsor to Detroit, and then he meets Henry Ford in 1904, the Model T doesn't get going until 1908 and 1910. So he just got lucky. If he had signed up with some other manufacturer, of which there were many in Detroit, they would have gone bankrupt. Many, many, many firms went bankrupt.
What if Gordon McGregor didn't meet Henry Ford? Would Ontario still be the heart of Canada's auto industry? Or could it be New Brunswick? Hi, I'm Paul Haberstrood. Welcome to The Cost of Living. You know what's great about Cost of Living listeners? Beyond your kindness, good looks, and refusal to be pandered to? Every now and then, when we ask if you're curious about anything, you ask great questions. And today, we're taking a crack at answering some of them. Like, when you're traveling and you stop at the duty-free store, is buying stuff there any cheaper? You also had questions about crown corporations. Who runs them? Pays for them? Why do we have them? One of you looked out at all those rooftops in your city and asked, what would it take to turn this place into a solar farm? So, let's get to it. Our first question today is about the auto industry.
Hi, my name is Jeanette Page. I understand that Ontario hosts 5 automakers and that no other province has even one. Why is that? Could an automaking industry exist in Alberta or Saskatchewan, for example? I love the show. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jeanette. Well, Alice Cho, let's start with her first question. Why is Canada's auto industry mostly just in Southern Ontario?
Because there's a lot of history there. The auto industry goes back more than 100 years in Southern Ontario, and it's mainly thanks to geography.
Southern Ontario is beside Detroit and beside Michigan, where Detroit was kind of like the Silicon Valley of its day.
Dimitri Anastakis teaches business history at the University of Toronto, and he's written books about the auto industry. He says car making really took off in Ontario after a Canadian businessman named Gordon McGregor crossed the river and met Henry Ford. That led to Ford setting up this manufacturing plant in Windsor, Ontario in 1904.
Why did Henry Ford do that at all? Why did he even bother with Ontario? Why didn't he just stay in Detroit?
Because Ford wanted to sell to Canadians. And at that time, we were charging a 35% tariff on foreign-made cars. So a $500 Model T built in Detroit would cost a Canadian buyer $675.
So one of the ways to get around that was to build cars across the border that would be made at Ford of Canada, and you could sell those for $600, and it'd still be cheaper than the tariff, and the money ultimately would go back to the Ford Motor Company.
So Ford set up shop in Ontario, then General Motors and Chrysler followed, and now, Dimitri says, you have this fully integrated auto sector throughout North America. You'll have this axle made in Canada, a transmission made in Mexico, and they'll go back and forth across borders before they're fully assembled in the US or Canada.
So one of the really interesting things about the auto industry, even though it started in Canada as a consequence of tariffs to some degree, over time, it's been the poster child of the reduction of tariffs and the integration of the economy.
A certain amount of irony here, though, now, right? Because tariffs are back. Trump is obviously a big tariff guy. He's threatening, 10, 20% tariffs on Canada. The auto industry, they're not digging this.
No, they're not. An open border has been good for them. Dimitri says the industry has benefited from economies of scale. You have 3 big automakers all in one place, creating more jobs, drawing more people.
Once you have a critical mass of an awful lot of different types of sectors in a big industry and a lot of people coming in there, it grows and grows and grows, and it stays. And we've had that for a long time because between Windsor all the way to Oshawa, there have been over time 5, 6, and 7 automakers at different times.
Well, this just isn't a car thing either. Like, you see this in a lot of different industries. Something like Silicon Valley. It gets started, then all the smart tech workers go there, more engineers, the whole thing. Or if you look at Canada, like Vancouver is Hollywood North because so many people have moved there who all know how to make movies that the industry's like, yeah, let's go make them there.
Exactly. But Dimitri says Ontario didn't have all the business when it came to cars. Back in the 1920s, Ford had assembly plants in Winnipeg and Regina for a while to build the Model T. Quebec had auto plants for decades, like they still make auto parts there. And another example, the Bricklin. It was a sports car made in the 70s that had these gull wings that swung up like the Batmobile, and that was made in New Brunswick.
Not exactly an auto hotbed, New Brunswick.
No, the guy behind the car was an American millionaire, Malcolm Bricklin. He had this dream to build his own car, but he needed a partner with money, and New Brunswick was willing to pay. But it said, you got to build the car here and you got to hire the locals.
So what happened to the Bricklin?
Well, it only lasted a few years. About 3,000 of them rolled off the assembly line before the company went bankrupt.
The problem was that they weren't building enough cars fast enough and well enough to make enough money to keep going. Anytime a car company wants to start up, it's really, really costly to do because it takes so much technical know-how, expertise, human resources, design.
Dimitri says the Bricklin is an example of why it's so hard to build an auto industry from scratch.
And it's also kind of an answer to the second part of Jeanette's question. She wanted to know, why can't the auto industry start up in another province, like, say, Alberta? Like, why doesn't it have a piece of the auto industry?
Yeah, Dimitri says you'd need government backing, workers who know how to make cars. And with any industry, you want to be close to your customers.
You know, Alberta, even though it's a beautiful province and a wonderful province, is not that close to a lot of the major automotive markets in terms of where people sell cars. You know, California is a big one, but really in Eastern North America is where a lot of the market is, but also a lot of the production.
Yeah, really. Like, why would an automaker set up shop in another province? The market isn't there. The population isn't really there. The location itself also, as he's talking about, a disadvantage.
Yeah, like why take the risk? Over the last century and a half, at least 1,000 companies have tried to make cars, and Dimitri says only about 15 of them survived in North America.
Those are terrible odds.
No kidding. Dimitri says a recipe for success is a combination of many things like circumstances, geography, timing, and a bit of luck.
Like Gordon McGregor, when he walks across from Windsor to Detroit, and then he meets Henry Ford in 1904, you know, the Model T doesn't get going until 1908 and 1910. So he just got lucky. If he had signed up with some other manufacturer, of which there were many in Detroit, they would have gone bankrupt. Many firms went bankrupt.
But Ford wasn't one of them. We got the Mustang and the F-150. Good job by you, Gordon McGregor. Thanks, Ellis.
You're welcome. And thanks for your question, Jeanette.
Hey, it's Rob. I had a question. I was walking through a duty-free shop at the airport the other day, and it didn't seem like anything was cheaper. So what's the deal? Are items actually cheaper at duty-free?
Good question. So how free is duty-free?
Lisa Delna is an American married to a Canadian. She splits her time between Calgary and Los Angeles, which means she takes a lot of international flights.
I thought it was like 5, and I started looking at my calendar on my phone, and I realized it was like closer to 8 or 9. And I'm like, okay, I traveled a lot more this year than I realized.
And every trip to that departure gate goes the same way.
You come through security, you've been in a long line, you're sort of stressed out and nervous, then you come upstairs, you come up the escalators, and all of a sudden there are these bright lights. It's like you've wandered into Nordstrom's department store.
Ah, the glitz and glamour of duty-free, with its glittering bottles of French perfume and giant Toblerone bars.
It's like, okay, it's time to shop. I've got 2 hours to kill. What can I do? So it is brilliant placement, and it's really thought out carefully. Sort of, you have this captive audience, and ready to spend money.
And we do spend. In 2023, revenue from the global duty-free market was close to $40 billion. But have you ever asked yourself, what is duty?
I'll have a chance to go to the duty-free shop. Huh?
The duty-free shop?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen that episode where they have a conversation where they're like, what even is duty?
Paul Brady is the news director for travel and leisure. He says, in the simplest terms,
Duty is a tax. It's a tax for bringing a product across international borders. So duty is a tax that you pay for importing something.
and that tax is waived at duty-free shops because they exist in a kind of geographical gray zone. Like they're in a country, but their customers are about to leave the country.
So even though that bottle of scotch is technically inside the Paris airport, for purposes of taxes, it never really entered France because you're already taking it out of France. And that's the part that's duty-free.
Paul says duty-free stores sell luxury because high-end products are often the most heavily taxed. Same thing for booze. So these products offer the greatest potential for savings. But your savings might only be on the tax. The purchase price, well, that's another thing.
People tend to think of duty-free as some kind of magical markdown, when really the operators are free to charge really whatever they like. They may have taken duty out of the equation, but they can still charge whatever the market will bear.
Right now, the price for a bottle of Ralph Lauren perfume at the Pearson Duty Free is much cheaper than at Walmart. But a bottle of Crown Royal costs about the same as at the LCBO. So shopping at duty free is sometimes cheaper, sometimes not. But you can price check ahead of time online. And Paul says it's not always about scoring a deal. Duty-free stores sell things you can't find anywhere else, like giant boxes of Tic Tacs filled with smaller boxes of Tic Tacs.
But I do think there's something to the idea of, hey, we've been on a great trip. We've got some gifts for our loved ones, but I forgot that person. Let me grab one thing. Or I've got a few extra euros in my pocket. Let me just go ahead and splurge on this. You know, those can be some good gifts and good memories too.
I like to stop at the duty-free shop. I like to stop at the duty-free shop. I like to stop.
For the Cost of Living, I'm Jennifer Keane.
It's questions and answers today on the Cost of Living. I'm Paul Habersrud. Our next question is actually a bunch of questions.
Hi, this is Mickey Rigby from Truro, Nova Scotia. I have a recollection of life before Crown Corporations. I'm wondering if Crown Corporations are indeed effective. Who is the CEO accountable to? If it's the board of directors, who appoints the board? If there's a deficit, who is responsible for the deficit? And if there's a profit, who benefits?
So, what do we need to know about Crown Corps? Well, they're owned by governments, federal and provincial, and they're kind of private, kind of public. As for your recollection about life before Crown Corps, Mickey, well, they've been around for a while. Canadian National Railway was created in the 1920s. In the 30s, we got the Bank of Canada, and, yes, the CBC. But
the golden age of state-owned enterprises was largely in the post-war period. Okay, so the 1950s and 60s and sort of early 70s. So this is the development of the welfare state, and we got pensions and healthcare and built the universities and the highways and all of those kind of things.
Malcolm Bird is a public policy professor at the University of Winnipeg. He studies Crown Corps. They can be controversial. Not everyone likes them. He's more of a supporter. When a lot of crown corporations were created, the economy was rolling, the population was booming, the country needed a lot of stuff. Telephone networks, electricity generation, financing. Now, the private sector did some of it. Other times, government stepped in. Canada now has 44 federal crown corporations. Some of them are household names. Via Rail, the Royal Canadian Mint. But there's also like the Great Lakes Pilotage Authority. Provincially, there's a bunch more. Every one of these has a different reason for being. But in general, if you look at the argument for Crown Corps, Malcolm says it's this. Private businesses don't always do everything a country might want them to do. Canada's big. Not every private company wants to be out there serving every rural community.
Canada Post is the best illustration of this. So the way it essentially works is that Canada Post is obligated to provide mail and package delivery to every address in Canada, regardless of where it is and the costs associated with it. So you can think about how important this is for people in small towns, in rural communities, Indigenous communities, up north, et cetera, where there isn't a market incentive to provide post and parcel services to those communities.
For $1.15, you can put a stamp on a letter and mail it from Wawa to Whitehorse. Is there a business case for doing this? Not really. Malcolm says Canada Post, which is obligated to provide this service, fills a gap in the free market.
There's sort of what we would call a market failure, where the market is not able to provide sufficient services to rural and remote communities. So what Canada Post does is that it uses the revenues it earns from its urban operations in terms of mail delivery and package delivery, and then it cross-subsidizes from those revenue-earning business lines to provide services to rural and remote communities which are not revenue positive.
Canada Post hasn't made money since 2017. So, to Mickey's question, what happens if there's a deficit? Well, Crown Corps run like private businesses, so they might borrow money to cover operating expenses. But they're also not really private, so they might get a subsidy. And if things go really bad, government picks up the tab. Now, if they make money, governments get the profits. But this is where being private and public can get tricky. Look at something like provincial liquor boards. They're cash cows for governments. But provinces don't want them selling too much booze. They don't want to encourage excessive drinking. So it's like, make some money, but not too much. Other Crown Corps live in this same in-between world, like provincially run auto insurance, which Malcolm has where he lives in Manitoba.
The standing order to the Crown, the auto insurers, is don't lose any money, okay, because they don't want to provide a subsidy, but it's don't make any money either, because if you make too much money, everybody gets mad and says, you're charging us too much for the auto insurance. So the insurers have to kind of play this very careful game of just earning enough money to cover their costs and have adequate reserves, but not to make too much money because people get upset.
To borrow from Kermit the Frog, it ain't easy being a quasi-private, quasi-public Crown corporation. A big argument against Crown Corps is that government shouldn't be in the business of business at all. They think, hey, let the market take care of it. And Crown Corps can sometimes get in the way of that. Like the CBC competing for advertising revenue with private media companies. This can be a constant tension, and no one's happy if the losses keep piling up.
I mean, one of the reasons the government privatized something like Canadian National Railways and Air Canada was because there was the threat of ongoing losses. And the problem when they're state-owned is that you can't reduce the cost structure fast enough or effective enough because of political variables. So in the case of Canadian National Railways, they couldn't cut their rural and northern rail lines without too much of a fuss, as it were, from the political sphere, from their owners, from the people who are affected.
Theoretically, Crown Corps are supposed to operate at arm's length from government. They're run by a CEO, But that CEO reports to a board of directors, and who appoints them? Government. So this can be a recipe for political interference. Crown Corps have a lot to juggle. Politics, public scrutiny, fulfilling non-market obligations while competing with private companies. So back to Mickey's big question. Are they effective? Well, that's in the eye of the beholder. When Malcolm looks at Canada's system of private companies and Crown Corps, he thinks it ends up covering most of what this country needs. It's like a division of labor. He says private companies,
they resolve all of the simpler and profitable challenges we face. And then all of the more difficult, thankless, expensive, complex, long-term, and sometimes intractable problems fall in the public sector.
So Malcolm, anyway, believes Crown Corps have a role to play because they do things the private sector won't. Hope that got to it for you, Mickey. Thanks for the question. This is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Havershrud. Our last question today is from Mary Delkey in Calgary. She's wondering about the economics of solar and if investing $20,000 into panels makes sense for her. She's a senior and isn't sure how long she'll be in her house. But
I would be happy to rent my roof space to have a company put solar panels on my roof. Why couldn't a utility, either private or public, come into the city and install solar panels on all those south-facing roofs and turn the city into a solar farm?
So, Danielle Nerman, could houses in every city become their own little power plants?
Well, if you're really into renewables, that is the dream. Cover every inch of unused space in a city with solar.
Because, hey, why not? You got the roofs, you got the sun.
You do. And electricity demand is only going up. By 2050, it's expected to double. And there's a lot of pressure to green up the grid. But right now, only about 4% of Canadian homes are powered by solar.
And Mary's wondering, hey, how do we make that number go up?
And there are a few places trying to turn cities into solar farms, like Los Angeles. It's been slapping panels on commercial buildings since the 90s. And a few years ago, LA started installing solar on residential roofs on its own dime. All the electricity goes back to the city, and homeowners collect rent.
Anywhere from $240 to $600 per year. These are 20-year agreements, so they can go as high as $12,000 over the course of the lifespan of that system.
Arash Sadie is the power engineering manager with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power.
What he's describing there, that is a very different model from what we have here.
Right? But this program in LA, it's still small. Only 37 houses so far have been set up.
Okay, so they're just piloting it.
Yeah, it's early days, but Los Angeles has bigger hopes for the program. They want this future where electricity generation is much more distributed, in all kinds of places across cities. Because if you look at how most Americans and Canadians get electricity right now, it's from a centralized source, big power plants. Often, electricity has to travel a long way to get to us, and Arash Sadie thinks that's risky.
You don't obviously want to put all your eggs in one basket and say, we're just going to do this and this only. As we look at it from a holistic perspective, we need to have local resources because in the event those transmission lines aren't available, well, you still need to have energy, right? And that's where having local solar and eventually energy storage provides reliability to the grid.
And this is really where solar seems to be moving. You look at solar generation globally, it's doubling every 2 or 3 years. And this would really seem to be a good fit for what he's talking about there, this idea of decentralizing the power grid and having a lot of micro generation coming from different households.
Sure, and Warren maybe thinks it could work, but it wouldn't be a slam dunk. He's the director of the Queen's Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy.
Part of the challenge is that an individual home is not a big power generating, site. It's only going to generate kilowatts and not megawatts worth of power. And so we tend to think of that as small potatoes compared to some of the other options that are out there.
Like a solar farm. It's out on wide open land with thousands of giant panels. It's going to pump out way more power than a patchwork of city dwellings. But the big reason why no companies in Canada are knocking on your door, asking you if they can rent your roof for solar, it's this.
For the most part, our electricity rates are just not high enough to justify that investment just yet.
Yeah, when you look at power prices in this country, Canada actually has some pretty cheap electricity compared to a lot of other places.
Yeah, especially Europe. The Irish, I looked this up, they pay around 50 cents per kilowatt hour, and the Germans pay a little less than that, except when they get hit with a Dunkelflaute.
I just want you to say Dunkelflaute again.
Dunkelflaute is now my favorite German word. It means dark doldrums, and it's describing the weather when there's no wind or sun. And this happened last month in Germany. Electricity prices went through the roof because they are so reliant on renewables. And at one point, people were paying $1.50 per kilowatt hour.
So that tripled, even for the Germans.
Yes. And in Calgary, where our electricity comes from mostly natural gas, you can lock in right now for 3 years at about 9 cents per kilowatt hour.
We're really lucky with geography in Canada in that we have access to lots of hydropower. We have access to nuclear power in a couple of provinces, to a very large degree. We've got access to a lot of different generation capacity. We're not at a position where just yet we need that additional solar power in the grid.
But as you're saying, we'll be there soon. Electricity demand in Canada is just going up and up and up.
Yeah, and solar power is getting cheaper every year, and technology is improving, so who knows? I mean, I just love this. Mercedes just announced it's developing a new paint that will charge your EV when you're driving in the sun. So they're going to paint solar paint on their cars.
Yeah, I've heard about this. It's not commercial yet, but this is a real thing that it's coming. It's cool stuff.
And maybe easier to install than solar panels. Just roll a coat on your roof. The future, Paul, it's sunny.
Not even a Dunkelflaute will stop us now, Nerman.
No dark doldrums for us.
Thanks for that. And thanks for the question, Mary. That's all for this week. The show is based in Calgary. The Cost of Living is produced by Daniel Nerman, Ellis Cho, and Jennifer Keene, with help from Jeff Kynock. I'm Paul Haberstrood. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for listening.